So Min Sook Lee is an award-winning Canadian filmmaker with a diverse and prolific portfolio of multimedia work. Her doc filmography includes the Gemini-nominated El Contrato, which looks at the lives of Mexican migrant workers in Ontario, Tiger Spirit, a personal reflection on reunification between North and South Korea, Hogtown, a dissection of the politics of policing in Toronto City Hall, and those films all have won awards, and there's other ones, of course. Min Sook is a recipient of the Cesare Chavez Black Eagle Award for El Contrato's impact on the rights of migrant workers. Canada's oldest Labour Arts Festival, Mayworks Festival, has named the Min Sook Lee Labour Arts Award in her honor, and the award recognizes outstanding contributions to the arts and labor movement. Min Sook is an assistant professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, where she teaches integrated media art and social change. That sounds like an amazing course, and I wish we had one here at Concordia. We should get one. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of labor, border politics, migration, art, and clearly social change. Min Sook has served as a judge and guest speaker for various film organizations, film festivals, and is about to wrap her most recent documentary, Migrant Dreams, which tells the undertold story of migrant agricultural workers struggling against Canada's temporary foreign workers program. It's set to have its world premiere next month at the Hot Docs International Canadian Documentary Film Festival. And so I would like to invite Min Sook up now, and please give her a warm welcome.
So thank you so much, Ezra, and thank you, Svetla and Cinema Politica. And thank you, Alanis Obomsawin, for gracing us with your presence here tonight. And thanks to all of you, activists and filmmakers, students and community members, for coming here tonight to be part of this. And I think this is such an important organization, celebrating filmmakers like myself and filmmakers like Alanis Obomsawin and John Grayson, who received the award last year. It's really special to be in a community of organizers, activists who understand how film can be used as a really powerful tool for building communities, for building dialogue, imagining our futures, re-narrativizing our realities, and fighting back. And understanding film is a really powerful tool for fighting back. And also, I also want to acknowledge this land as territory of the Mohawk Algonquin First Nations. And when we do land acknowledgements, it is so important for me that we do that because it situates all of us in our particular locations and positionalities and our histories. And it addresses and rebuts a kind of a collective amnesia that this country keeps trying to put forward, the collective amnesia of the colonization and occupation of First Nations territories. And it critically interrogates colonial histories and challenges what the present day manifestations of that look like and feel like, and what they are today. And I think what they do too is it really brings kind of our personal narratives into the here and now. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself outside of my film work. I was born in South Korea and immigrated to Canada when I was 3 years old. And my family, Korea itself is a country that's been carved up by colonization and military history and imperialism. My grandfather was a migrant worker who worked in Japan in the forestry industry, and then in Korea itself, Japanese colonization ensured that my father and my mother grew up never speaking Korean. They were forced to speak Japanese and forced to take Japanese names. And then the colonization period ended in 1945 when Japan surrendered in World War II. And there had been a Korean independence movement to fight against Japanese colonization, but that movement was quickly disappeared when imperial power structures, global power, superpowers, the USSR at the time, and USA carved Korea up into two countries. They carved it up like a steak with imperial steak knives into North and South Korea. And Korea is still divided today, and the war continues today. My father was a soldier who was trained with the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. He was militarized, and that was his professional training. So he brought that back home into our homes, and domestic violence and militarized violence was part of my growing up. So what happens on the global political spheres is very much what happens inside our kitchens, inside our bedrooms as we grow up. And it deeply impacted my life. So when we came to Canada, it wasn't an escape. It wasn't as though that history was dissected and disappeared. In fact, what happened was that history was lengthened and deepened into new realities. Because as immigrants, as working class immigrants, we then encountered racism, poverty, and anti-immigrant bashing in Toronto in the 1970s. And then you throw in domestic violence and sexual abuse at home against a backdrop of cultural erasure and against a whole backdrop in which you feel completely disappeared in the shadow of a kind of white supremacist cultural society. And you can get a sense of what it was like to grow up in Toronto in the 1970s. But as an immigrant working class kid in Toronto, I was able to find my political and cultural voice, and I did that through artists, activists, largely all women of color, queer women, and I joined different movements as a teenager. At the time, we were organizing in the anti-apartheid movement, and I was a part of a high school group called Youth Against Apartheid. And what we used to do would be, we'd go to high schools and make presentations about apartheid, show films, play music, and then talk about the political histories and the freedom movement in South Africa, and talk about building solidarity in Canada and the links we had across borders. And that really activated me, and the people who led that movement were very much people who were dispossessed from colonial societies and regrouping back here in Canada. And through that kind of work as a teenager with Youth Against Apartheid, I met artists like Faith Nolan, who is a singer and an activist in the Black community, Dion Brand, who's a poet, and Grace Channer, who is a painter. And women like that showed me through the way in which they lived and how they fought back that art and activism, you can't separate them. And it's not a lifestyle choice. It's not a professional credit. It's deeply rooted in how you live your life and how you answer to systems that would disappear you or marginalize you or simply rewrite your story so that you fit a stereotype. And it was with that group that I was part of forming different community-based organizations like Sisters Cafe. And in Sisters Cafe, we had a space outside of Toronto. Because oftentimes when you're growing up in the urban space, you don't have access to land, to being out in the country, to knowing what fresh air smells like. A lot of immigrant kids grow up in downtown Toronto, and they don't have the cottages to go to, right? So we had land, and we called it Camp Sis, and we'd organize drives from different people who had cars, and then set up a space where women could organize and talk about our realities and our histories and reimagine. And we were part of a group called Multicultural Women in Concert, and again, women of color, immigrant women, working class women, using the arts, dance, and poetry, and theater, and film to re-represent ourselves and to challenge the ways in which we were told that we didn't exist in mainstream media and mainstream culture. So it was a real hotbed of activism and art that really formed how I could speak back to a reality that would silence me. And I had a real hard time seeing myself as a filmmaker or as an artist first, and I still kind of struggle with those labels, but I think we all struggle with labels because they tend to be essentializing or trying to wholly defining. Because it was always at politics and activism that brought me towards using the arts and media as a tool for social change. And my first encounter with media was first radio, campus radio, and I used to work at CKLN Radio in Toronto, which was an extraordinary place to be in the 1990s when anti-poverty activists, anti-psychiatry activists, anti-colonial activists, people working for the land. There are so many of us who would converge in this one radio dial, 88.1 FM, and we created a space and a voice of resistance. It was an exciting time to work in media. We had a satellite coming out from the CN Tower, and we knew we could sometimes cross the border to the US. And to understand and know the power of media to translate and to crisscross borders and communities and speak realities that we don't see in mainstream media, that was deeply invigorating. So I came into documentary from that media introduction. I've spent most of my documentary life working on social justice stories. And for tonight, I wanted to focus on the stories and the activism within the migrant justice communities. So we've picked 3 clips from 3 different films. We'll play for you El Contrato, which was released in the year 2000. And I produced that with the National Film Board of Canada. That was my first feature, and we're going to play for you a little short I made for the May Works Festival, which I filmed with Mexican women who are in the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And then finally, we'll play the first 10 minutes of a feature. So the first documentary I ever made about migrant workers was in 2000, and I made it because of a wildcat strike in Leamington, Ontario. At the time, I wanted to start making documentaries, but I didn't have money to go to film school, and I didn't really, I'm kind of an untrainable person. I work better just on the field or doing it as opposed to reading it in books. So I found other women filmmakers who would let me be on set or be with them as they were shooting to learn just how you make documentaries. And El Contrato came about because I ran into Chris Ramsaroop. He is a labor organizer in the streets of Toronto, and he said to me, there's a strike happening in Leamington, Ontario. Migrant workers are called a work stoppage. And Chris was organizing a bus, an information bus for activists, journalists, and media workers to go on the bus and find out more about the situation of migrant workers in southwestern Ontario. At the time, I knew very little. So I went on the bus, and it takes about 4 hours from Toronto to Leamington. And I have to say, I was really, really shocked because I had no idea what was happening in our own backyards. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and the bus drove into the parking lot of a church in Leamington. And the church service, the Spanish language church service, had just been let out. There were about, I would say, 200 Mexican men who were in the church parking lot. And they were milling about. There were, as is often in this kind of location, there were trucks selling food, used clothing, CDs, and things like that. But as soon as our bus got into the parking lot and we got off, there were a number of Spanish-speaking people on the bus with us. The people who spoke Spanish were immediately surrounded by migrant workers. And the men had a lot of different questions, and they had a lot of concerns. There were questions about poor living accommodations. There were questions about unpaid overtime, unpaid wages, accidents on the farms. People were rolling up their sleeves and showing us rashes where their arms had been burned from exposures to pesticides. People had their income tax forms that they were carrying with them, and they had questions about applying for CPP and EI because they were paying into Canada's tax program, but they didn't have support. Very few of the workers spoke English as to how to access those different forms. There were so many questions, and it made me realize that there is this labor program that it was as though the federal government had brought in workers and simply dumped them and left them to their own devices with no supports and no means of advocacy or speaking or finding information about what their labor and human rights were. And this is, to me, my first encounter with Canada's foreign labor program really, in some ways, I don't think I had innocent eyes. But I think that I, like many people, really think of migrant workers at that time as being an American story, as being one south of the border. And I had never made a connection to the food that we buy in the grocery stores and thought about who it is that's, packing that food or picking the fruits and such. So I went on to make El Contrato after that one time going into that trip to Leamington. And one thing I noticed when I was in Leamington was there was this concentrated population of migrant workers, but when you walk through the streets of Leamington, there is this kind of a divide between the Canadians, and then migrant workers were kind of secretly or hidden in small little corners. It was as though the town itself had this invisible apartheid. And I've since gone on to understand that Canada's labor program, the temporary foreign worker program, and the different migrant programs that we have creates a labor apartheid within our own borders here. I'd like to play for you the first clip from El Contrato to give you a sense of some of the workers I met and their stories. I think Teodoro, who's the main person who I spent most of the time with in Leamington filming El Contrato, who you saw calling his son Miguel for his 16th birthday, he still works in Leamington. He's been in the program now 21 years. And I just saw him a few weekends ago. And he's been part of the seasonal agricultural worker program, 8 months here, 4 months back, for 21 years. Growing the tomatoes in our supermarkets. And it's so interesting because Gabe, the young white supervisor you see who talks about Mexicans are human, but life is funny. He's now the supervisor at the farm that I've been shooting in most recently, where I've just finished wrapping my most recent feature. And it's just interesting to see how those stories still continue. And, when I look at that scene, I think about the role that the Mexican Consulate plays in how they take advantage of workers and the racialized divisions within the Mexican community, because the consular reps are all Spanish descendants, and most of the migrant workers are indigenous. Some of them don't speak Spanish. And that kind of internal power structure and how nation states use migrant workers as a means of building foreign currency, as a means of playing in a global neoliberal economy. And then when I see that scene as a filmmaker, I think about Teodoro calling his son and wishing him happy birthday, as he has had to do for the past 21 years. That scene in particular is really special to me because it was Teodoro who suggested I come to his house at 5 in the morning. And I didn't know why, and he wouldn't tell me why. He just said, come with the camera. I said, all right. And I waited outside the house. And then he came downstairs with Abel, and Abel had a guitar, and I thought, okay. And then I just followed them to the payphone. And Teodoro knew how he wanted to construct that scene. And he taught me a lot about documentary filmmaking, that it's a process of collaboration, and it's a process of mutual discussion. And you don't have to tell every story. Not everyone deserves or warrants knowing everything about a worker's life. Workers have a choice to disclose what they want to disclose, and it's very strategic. And as an activist political filmmaker, I am part of that strategy of negotiation and understanding that the film that we co-create in many ways is something that we use to advance a political movement. That's part of how I learned that. And I didn't learn that process, and I didn't know it when I started out making El Contrato. When I started making El Contrato, I thought, the National Film Board, they're going to teach me how to make films. It's going to be great. Now this is a way to properly do it because I've only been, learning kind of on the streets, ad hoc, my own style. What I realized was everything they wanted me to do, I was just in my gut against. And they paired me with, professional crews, older white men who had lots of decades of experience, filming in many, many different countries, who disrespected me in the field, who overruled choices I made. And I realized as I was making that film, and then every film since then, that it's very much a process where you must trust your own guts. And you have a political radar which brought you to that story and this situation in the first place, and not to be overwhelmed by the kind of machinery of an industry that would take your voice away from you. So let me give you a brief overview of the contours of the migrant worker programs in Canada. And today there's about 500,000 migrant workers working here in Canada with temporary status, and they come from over 80 different source countries. And of that group, 110,000 are low-wage migrant workers who work at minimum wage jobs in agriculture, cleaning hotels, vaccinating chickens, in the service industry, and primarily Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, actually every province, but that's where the majority are. And the federal government has run a range of migrant programs. There is the Live-in Caregivers program that is for nannies, and that program was started in the 1960s, primarily with women from the Caribbean, and then women from the Philippines dominate that program now. And I know part of the reason why women from the Philippines have comprised a large percentage of the domestic workers who are in the Living Caregiver program is because the women from the Caribbean were seen as organizing and too politically active. And there was a decision made about how much more compliant Asian women supposedly are. There's a seasonal agricultural worker program, and that operates as a bilateral agreement between the Canadian government and then other governments with signatories to the agreements, such as Mexico and Caribbean nations. And the seasonal agricultural program brings workers in for periods of time, 6 months, 8 months, or 10 months, and then workers have to go back repeatedly. And many workers have been doing so for 20, 30 years. And in that program, they pay into our tax, CPP and EI and such. And then there is a temporary foreign worker program. And that program itself has expanded quite a bit since it was introduced, and it's probably the fastest growing part of our migrant worker schemes in Canada. And migrant workers themselves, as I said, are employed in a wide range of industries, construction and healthcare and food and such. Other than the Living Caregiver program, the other programs have no pathways to citizenship. And or very few pathways to citizenship. And the only reason the Living Caregiver program has, the woman fought for a pathway to citizenship in the 1980s, and they organized and they mobilized, and they were able to argue for a doorway to citizenship, but it had some stringent requirements that the women in the program had to live with their employers in their employer residence, and they had to work for 2 years and good behavior and such, and then they would earn a pathway to citizenship. But most of the migrant worker programs cycle workers in and out, and the work itself there's a chronic labor shortage, but the work status is constructed as temporary. And I think reframing and understanding that makes us understand how migrant worker programs work hand in hand with immigration policies. Since 2006, the number of temporary workers in Canada has exceeded the permanent residents who are brought in, who are allowed permission entry into the country. So what you're seeing here is that Canada is redesigning what the labor force looks like through migrant worker programs. And I think oftentimes, this country is celebrated as a diverse nation, and multiculturalism is a national myth that still prevails. Well, migrant worker programs draw attention to the fabrication of that myth. And as these programs grow, I think they really draw question to how we treat, how a two-tiered system of labor and human rights has grown in this country. When workers come in, low-wage workers come into Canada, they are tied to one employer, one job site. And the over-reliance on one employer for housing, for transportation, access to health care, this creates a relationship that's been called a modern form of feudalism. And there's a disproportionate power imbalance. When I visit farms and I see certain workers are favored by an employer, so that they might be able to access the phone more frequently or be given more trips to the store or the bank. There's a way in which power is exercised, not just within a group of workers, but also amongst nationalities. So, I'll go to a greenhouse which has, let's say, 200 workers, what's interesting is that these days what the employer does is, of that 200 workforce population, maybe 20 will be from Jamaica, 20 will be from Colombia, 20 from El Salvador, 20 from Guatemala. Is this to ensure that workers, the kind of divide and rule tactics that employers use to control workers is enforced? Because there's a sense of division then, and workers themselves, might take that on and say, oh yes, well we're better workers than the Guatemalans, and there's different ways in which workers are controlled racially and through the sources, the places they come from. This program is employer driven. And so the employer brought you into the country, the employer can kick you out. Independent monitoring of the program is virtually non-existent. And this is a system that invites abuse. When you hear about abuse in the migrant worker program, it's not because there was an individual bad person acting, with bad judgment. It's because a system has been set up to invite abuse, in which situations of abuse are almost inevitable. In fact, it's profitable. A new development of the migrant worker programs, and this is particularly with the temporary foreign worker program, is the growth of private recruiters. The seasonal agricultural worker program is government to government, so the Canadian government will communicate with the Ministry of Labor in Mexico, and workers are then approved and brought into the country. With the temporary foreign worker program, this is a private program, so employers can recruit workers from anywhere in the world. Oftentimes, employers really would rather not do all the middle work, so they hire private recruiters. Private recruiters are charging from $6,000 upwards to $12,000 to workers for the privilege of working here in minimum wage jobs. And because the fees are so high, many workers come indebted to the private recruiter. And they will agree to pay off the debt of the $6,000 to $10,000 recruitment fee through the years of working here. Part of their salary, the Canadian salary, will go off to pay that debt. So that looks like a form of modern debt bondage. And it's not a unique story to Canada. It is happening globally across the world. Hong Kong, Dubai, Germany. I think what's unique to Canada is a few things. One is the near invisibility of the workforce. They are hidden from view, literally, on the landscape. Workers often live in housing that's away from main roads or tucked into the backs of greenhouses. I travel a lot and have shot a lot in the Niagara region, for example. And the Niagara region is beautiful. It's very picturesque. It's wine country. There's a lot of B&Bs there, and you go on those winding pathways. It looks wonderful. It's a postcard. But if you went a little bit further into the back roads, there are shacks, unheated shacks or trailers where there's 20 workers living in a very small enclosed place. And I think that invisibility is part of what constructs the mainstream narrative of Canada's story. Mainstream media does not cover migrant workers, and when they do so, it's with a kind of a xenophobic protectionism. Migrant workers are here stealing Canadian jobs, and when they take space in mainstream media, they're also often overly victimized and seen as perpetual victims or natural organic victims, somehow essentialized, as though, well, what can you expect? And then there's a Canadian savior. I think migrant workers are very aware of the unjust situation, but it's about access to speaking out. It's about a system that punishes and penalizes them if they do speak out, and no pathways to advocacy, or very little. And the ways in which the system constructs them as vulnerable. So one of the intentions I have as a documentary filmmaker is to counter that idea of the victimized migrant worker, and to recognize, a lot of my work is in the field of the imagination. As Benedict Arnold understood, all nations are efforts of the imagination. So our imagined communities are reinforced by material realities like border points, immigration laws, and visas. But our imagined communities are grounded into collective and individual psyches through our creative imaginaries, our anthems or the public rituals, monuments. There's a monument being proposed to Rob Ford in Toronto right now, films. And it really is part of how the state uses culture as a way to reinforce a state-controlled message. So I'm really critically aware of how my documentaries can reinforce or challenge dominant representations of migrant workers, and how their stories inform the construction of a differentiated Canadian identity. And documentaries have always played that historic role. Nation-building function of documentaries is very much in the history of the National Film Board, which is the main production hub of documentaries here. And the NFB itself was founded by Grierson with this propagandist idea that, we needed a better mirror to see ourselves and to reflect, what this country is. So I think that the documentaries I work on are counter-narratives to the dominant imaginative fantasies of Canadian nationalism. And that kind of fantasy that refuses to see the colonial histories being played out in the contemporary migrant worker programs. Because these programs that I'm describing to you are really not that new. We had the head tax that was applied to Chinese railroad workers in the 1800s. So there's an extension of that legacy that we're looking at today. And I want to contextualize the documentaries I make with migrant workers as work that is intended for multiple audiences. The general public, people like you, people who are committed and interested in social issues and activists, but also for migrant worker communities to see themselves and to see the commonality of their experience, because they don't often have a chance to see that story, and then to recognize the unity of a collective experience. Oftentimes culture and language divides them, and a film screening with migrant workers can be incredibly unifying and bring a really strong, empowering voice of collective action. And, when I think about the films I make, I'm often thinking about that multiplicity of the gaze. And then how one scene can be read in so many diverse, heterogeneous ways, depending on the social, political, and economic position of the viewer. And I feel the stories I'm trying to tell can hold complex, differentiated realities. I have another scene of a short film I'd like to play for you. It's, confusingly enough, it's also called Migrant Dreams, but that was because I made it about 1.5 years ago. I've been shooting for 3 years on this feature I'm about to release. And as some of you know who are documentary filmmakers here, you shoot a lot, and then you end up wanting to make more than one film. So I've done that with the same title, though. Anyways, so this short film, it's 11 minutes, and I filmed it with women from Mexico who work in greenhouses just outside the Niagara region. And it played at the Mayworks Festival in Toronto. And I intend to continue filming with this group of women to eventually make a feature. Alex, I hope you have that one queued up, the short Migrant Dreams from Mayworks, and I can play that for you. I shot that, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago now, and I had cut that out of scenes I was shooting in the farms, thinking it would make it into the future, but as I've been shooting the past 3 years, a different story emerged. And so the feature that I ended up cutting and locking has completely different storyline. But it's interesting to me because when I look at that film, I look at Alejandra and the women that she works with. There's joy, there's dignity, there's resilience, there's power, and there's sadness, and there's anger, and there's a whole range and complexity of stories that defy this idea that you can contain or essentialize or completely, someone is wholly knowable. And I think that's always been a challenge for me in how you represent stories of others and stories of other people that's not your story. One of the mistakes or problems that can come forward when you're making documentaries and you're creating representations of someone's story is this mistake that you want to create someone who's wholly knowable, and that I think is a dehumanizing process, because which one of you is wholly knowable? Which one of you doesn't have contradictions and complexities and contradictors? I contradict myself every half an hour, really, in my own head, right? And to understand or try and find a way in which people can be fully human in the story that you're trying to tell is one of those pieces that's really important to me. And I always find it interesting. There's multiple reactions to Alejandro's story about what happens in Canada stays in Canada, because sometimes when people see that, they laugh or there's some tittering, because there's this unexpected idea that people don't really think, or they haven't seen or framed migrant workers as being risque or having sexual lives that challenge borders or challenge conventions, or having fun like that. And then at the same time, when I play this short with other migrant women from Thailand or Jamaica, when they see it, they recognize parts of their stories, and there's a familiarity and understanding of that collective experience that they have across communities and cultures. But then other women who've seen it from Mexico, from Alejandra's village, actually, when they saw it, they were upset with her because they thought she had told a story that should only stay within the community. Just to say the heterogeneity of views, of how people read in the media text, is as mixed and diverse as all of your reactions in this room. And so I'm often thinking about the multiplicity of audiences. So the work I'm doing, I think, is very much about creating an awareness about labor and human rights issue related to migrant workers. It's very much about working in solidarity with migrant justice activists in Canada and working in alliance with migrant workers to build a broad-based movement for social change, and to build a momentum for direct political and legislative change in the Canadian context around migrant worker programs. And through all of that filmic language, to create a common experience that's both emotional, intellectual, sensorial, and an experience that communicates the complexity of the challenges and opportunities migrant workers face in Canada. And I think I'm really mindful of not homogenizing communities. Ultimately, though, I think these are stories of resistance. And most of the work I do is about trying to have the documentaries I make be used as a tool for advocacy, for social change, and for education. And in the process, I've worked very, very closely with activists who are on the front lines, who are with Justice for Migrant Workers, which is a national advocacy group. Chris Ramsaroop and Evelyn Ancalada-Grez are featured in the documentary I'm about to release now. Evelyn is in the film you just saw. She was in El Contrato. And without their work and without them giving me access and support to the filmmaking I do, I don't think any of this work would be possible. But there's a national movement of migrant justice activists. Aziz Chowdhury is here with the Immigrant Workers Center, and there are migrant justice activists across Canada who are working together to form an alliance and support. And there is a new movement called Harvesting Freedom, and I encourage you to Google that later after this to see what is being planned. In the month of September, workers and activists are going to march from Leamington to Ottawa. And we're going to start on Labor Day and then end up in Ottawa. So that's a month-long campaign hitting all the different rural stops and speaking out for migrant justice and speaking about status and demanding status upon arrival, which I think many in the community say, oh, that's unrealistic, don't push for something you can't have. But at the same time, when living caregivers are fighting for status and pathways to citizenship in the 1980s, they were told they were unrealistic and they won that battle. So I'd like to play for you a short 10, 12 minutes from the feature I'm about to release to give you a sense of the story. And it was shot again in the town of Leamington, Ontario. And as I said, I didn't know that that's the story I would be filming 3 years ago. I thought it would be different. But as I was filming in Leamington, a group of women from Indonesia started talking to me, Evelyn and Kathy Kohler, who's an activist in Leamington. And together they spoke out about the situation at work with a recruiter. And they started fighting back. And I realized as I was filming that this new film is about chronicling resistance, and it's about how migrant workers resist in the different avenues of resistance that they choose, and the different solidarities that they build within their own communities. So I'll play for you the first 10 minutes of that. if anything is broadcast on Canadian television, and this is a documentary that was commissioned by TVO and that will be on Omni, it needs to pass insurance and errors and omissions, insurance brokers. And if they won't insure your film, then it won't be broadcast. And we're struggling with identifying the recruiter. So it looks like we're going to have to blur his face, blur a number of scenes, and at some point we can reveal his face because he eventually gets charged with criminal charges, extortion, and a whole sundry of other charges. And the only reason those charges were ever able to make it to the criminal court system is because 3 workers, one of whom I was filming with, had the courage to come forward and speak out and testify against him. They put their jobs on the line, and of course they were punished by the employer and have lost their jobs and now fighting for status, which is why we're not releasing images of the women in the film until the film premieres, because we're working on making sure that they do have status. But that's one of the ways in which the employers and the brokers work together to control the workers and ensure workers don't speak out. Even if someone does come forward and shares evidence with the police, it takes years for the case to make it to the criminal courts. And by that time, most workers aren't here in the country anymore because they've left, they don't have a job, they can't survive. There are so many structural ways in which workers' ability to speak out and advocate for themselves are structurally compromised. So this leads me to my final point about stakes. When I make documentaries like this, I recognize there are very high stakes. Workers who are cooperating in the film-making process are putting their jobs and their status on the lines, and they do so because I know they believe the documentary can be a powerful way of making change. And they're sick of it. They're sick of seeing themselves and their coworkers and their families members exploited, and they want to see change, and they believe in our system, they believe in the justice system, and they believe that people will care if they hear the truth. The unfortunate reality is many of the truths of migrant workers have been reported in mainstream media, but I think it takes a building of a momentum, a mobilization of a broad-based movement to use the truth to power. So in terms of the stakes, I think the women who are in the film are incredibly brave, and I'm really quite proud that they worked with me in making the film. And, just to harken back to the first migrant worker film I made in 2000, El Contrato, when we tried to release that film, the growers who were in the documentary served me with a libel defamation suit for $1 million, and the NFB and the producers, and they succeeded in shutting down El Contrato and delaying its release for about a year until the lawyers at the NFB managed to figure out a strategy that they felt would be safe to release the documentary. And I had to add a card in the beginning of the film to make it legally sound. But it was interesting for me because here I am, someone who has status, who's working in media, which is a privilege, and I was afraid. I had $1 million lawsuit, and I thought, oh my God, how can I can't pay that. I had a bicycle at the time, and I knew what fear was like, and I thought, this is what, I'm feeling like 1% of what the workers have put on stake in terms of being part of the documentary. But what was interesting to me was that during that whole time, El Contrato was embargoed. I went back to Leamington once with Evelyn and some of the organizers of Justice for Migrant Workers, and I was in that church again in the basement. And one of the workers recognized me, and he said, "You made El Contrato." And I said, "Yes, how do you know? And how did you see that film?" No one's supposed to see that film. And he said, "I have a pirated copy." And there were many pirated copies all over Leamington being sold in the tiendas and, under the counters and being traded in the greenhouses. And that really taught me a lesson about, sometimes we get co-opted by the fear and we just give into it without realizing that the resistance is so much more powerful and so much more possible, right? So, I think that's, for me, just to understand the journey of making documentaries of migrant workers, how I've grown as a filmmaker and as an activist, and recognizing the relationship and the tied bonds we have with migrant workers is critical to talk about when we talk about freedom and justice in Canada. So thank you very much. That was pretty amazing. That was in the early 1990s. And it was led by a group of activists. we were all women of color. We're almost all queer. And it was primarily, Faith Nolan, who's a singer, folk singer, and an activist. Melania Aguila, who is a filmmaker, and Barb Taylor, who's now a filmmaker and at the time was a sculptor. There was a whole group of us. And actually Lisa Valencia Svensson, who produced Migrant Dreams with me, was also part of that back then. So there was, there was land that Faith had bought, and she had bought it with Grace Channer, the painter. And then they decided, instead of privately owning that land, how about making that land available to the community of women in Toronto, a few hours outside of Toronto. So we formed, it was called Camp Sis. It still exists, but it's different today. At the time, though, we had a space in Parkdale, which isn't, Parkdale today is very gentrified, but then it was quite low income. And we had a little storefront, and we would have fundraising dances and events to raise money so that women could go to the camp, and then we'd have workshops, and we would do cultural organizing and political organizing sessions. And that lasted for a few years in its most active iteration. So that's what it looked like, and it was all about organizing sort of community grassroots and fundraising. Camp Sis didn't, at that time, have any government funding or any institutional funding. So it was a dream about creating a space, a safe space, for imagining and for building and for creating. And those are such deliberate choices. And filmmaking and documentary is so much about this construction of a narrative. And as a filmmaker, there is so much power that you have in representing. And, shooting 100 hours, bringing it down to 90 minutes, it's very much a deliberate choice about what story you're going to tell. And there's huge responsibility in that. I know that I think I've changed a lot over the past 16 years in terms of understanding that multiplicity of voice, but also recognizing the multiplicity of the gaze. I know that when I started making documentaries, I always kind of had this default, de facto homogenous viewer. And then I started to critically, interrogate that and ask myself, well, who is that viewer? And is it me? Is it my dad? Is it, the migrant worker? Because my dad, he'll see my films and he'll be like, they're okay, but you need more action, because he likes to see action, drama, like Western films, right? So he's kind of bored by them. But I think to resist the simplification of representation is really important, and to recognize that people can hold complicated, contradictory ideas and impulses. So. To resist the idea of creating the perfect hero or, the most sympathetic fighter. And when you're coming towards filmmaking and, documentary filmmaking as an activist, you're thinking of the movement, you're thinking of, political change. So I know that originally I had a real propagandistic streak in me, which I still do. But when I look at El Contrato and then I compare that to this current film I'm going to release, I see how I'm able to build much more complicated representations of people. And a huge part of that is the process of how you make the film and how you engage with people while you're making the film. In that, a lot of the times when I'm filming, I'm not filming. I'm just hanging out with workers and I'm getting to know them. I'm spending time eating, celebrating birthdays, driving to hospitals, dealing with the reality as a human being as opposed to some fake hat of I'm here now as a filmmaker. And I had to become comfortable with understanding that process is so much more, and I see that as a decolonizing process, trying to unschool myself from thinking there was some proper, way to make documentary, and then recognizing then the wholeness of storytelling and of people and how they take up space in the narrative. But that's very much, a part of the process of the filmmaking, and then, it enters when you're editing and making the edit choices. Yeah. Workers pay their own airfare.
So on top of the thousands of dollars they pay to this agency, they also pay their
No.
airfare to come here.
That fee included the airfare. Now, the problem, there are many, but in this situation, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program stipulates that the employer must pay the airfare. But oftentimes, this is how complicit employers are in how recruiters operate. It's not just about bad recruiters and employers not knowing anything about what's going on. It's the employers do not have to pay those costs associated with bringing workers into the program because the workers bear those costs. One piece about the Temporary Foreign Worker Program I think I didn't mention is that the new rules, and the rules are constantly changing as the government, tinkers with a program, oftentimes, not to the workers' interests. The current rules are that workers are in for 4 years in the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and then they can't be in the program for another 4 years. So 4 years in, 4 years out, which means then oftentimes when workers are here, the first year just trying to figure out the country, the program, the work. By the second or third year, they're wise to what's going on and start building agency and starting to meet others and resist and organize. By the fourth year, they're out. So there's another means of controlling worker resistance, the 4 in, 4 out, but also creating a disposable workforce. And it's, that enforced mobility. Note that it's a 90-minute feature. And we start off with tension and the drama of the story. And as any screenwriter will tell you, when you're writing a dramatic action, you start in the middle of the action, forget everything else. We start that way so that we can set up a narrative that's compelling. But in the 90 minutes of the film, I believe the human story comes out in a very developed way. There are 3 primary women who carry the story of Migrant Dreams. One of them marries her lover. She's trans, and he falls in love with another woman in the program, transitioned while we were filming. And their wedding is beautiful, and their choice to, and he's Hindu and she's Muslim, so it's not just dealing with that issue, but it's interfaith. It's a really brave, beautiful, courageous love story that we tell in the film. And another woman, we focus a lot on her child that she speaks to via Skype on her smartphone. So I think the human stories are woven in. It's not an investigative documentary. I don't spend time trying to, it's not a Fifth Estate style, a news reportage, but it's a blend. But one piece that I worked really hard at, and this is why I delayed releasing the film, was I had a film that seemed to work, but it was largely personal. And it was a lot about personal narratives and an individual story, the Indonesian workers in Leamington. And I started asking myself, what would be the pitfalls of that in terms of representing the broader system and structure that I'd like to draw attention to? Because I don't think what happened to the Indonesian woman is that particularly unique. I have encountered workers from so many different towns and greenhouses and different countries who are facing very similar situations, pesticide exposures, living accommodations that are abysmal, unpaid overtime, coercion on the work site, and also paying brokers. So I realized that if the story was just about Indonesian workers, it would become this kind of, oh, poor them, and they had bad luck, and they had a really crappy recruiter. So I spent extra time making sure we documented other stories from workers from Tunisia, workers from Mexico, and workers from Jamaica to broaden and contextualize the structure of the program, and to indicate that these situations of abuse are not incidental, they're not one bad apple, it's not as though there's one bad apple in the cart is rotten. And I really wanted to make sure that the narrative could hold that broader structural critique. Because I know I'm going to get challenged with this film, and we spent a lot of time working on the numbers piece. 500,000 workers in Canada with temporary status. Of that 500,000, 110,000 are low-wage migrant workers. And those are the workers that are the most precarious within the broader temporary foreign worker program. The temporary foreign worker program has different levels. If you're A and B, white-collar workers, Hollywood directors working in, Toronto shooting the latest, action flick. Those workers have different sets of rights. And there's different, completely, it's a very privileged kind of migrant worker existence, right? So that 500,000, 500,000 incorporates all levels of temporary workers. It's 110,000 that are low-wage migrant workers. But with the numbers game, just to say, there's another 500,000 who are here as international students who also face similar situations. And so we're looking at numbers that move up and down, and also with the Harper government, numbers, they would refuse to release numbers. So researchers often had trouble accessing the stats on how many workers are coming into Canada under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And some researchers had to file FOIs, Freedom of Information requests, just to get numbers. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that as the Temporary Foreign Worker Program has expanded with its problematic dimensions of private recruiters, workers themselves have been organizing, and there has been a growing solidarity movement in Canada in different communities across the country. Justice for Migrant Workers has grown. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union has been doing organizing and setting up support houses in different communities. They also have an organization called SAME, Students Against Migrant Exploitation, that has set up action groups in campuses across, university campuses across Canada. So I've seen a movement grow, I've seen mobilizing grow, and I've seen different tactics being used. So whether it's a human rights tribunals, whether it's criminal court cases, whether it's civil claims, and then also political organizing strategies. I think that the current campaign, Harvesting Freedom, is poised to possibly create a momentum for change that we haven't seen yet. And that's because it's the 50th anniversary of the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. I think that's, there's a national coalition of organizations that are calling for change, and the current federal government is going to be reviewing the Temporary Foreign Worker Program in May. There's a committee that's been set up that's consisting of different MPs. And so oftentimes political change is about alignment of the right people in the right place, and the movement hitting at the right time. So I believe this is, and the film can come out, I believe this is a moment for, real change, at our doorsteps.
And I just want to say a few words about Alanis. She made her first film, Christmas at Moose Factory, with the National Film Board in 1971, and now nearly 45 years later, Alanis is working on film number 50, I think, still with the National Film Board. Her groundbreaking canonical film, Kanasatake, 270 Years of Resistance, went behind the barricades at Oka, the Oka standoff, to intimate the perspectives and voices of Indigenous warriors who are otherwise typecast in mainstream media. And that film made a huge impact on those of us here at Cinema Politica, even though many of us saw it years after it came out in 1993, and it has contributed immensely to the building of our organization. Our mandate to screen truth to power, and our belief in the power of excellent political documentary to activate audiences, can all in part be traced back to this important paradigm-shifting film, and also to the many other works in Alanis's robust filmography. We are inspired by Alanis the filmmaker, a tireless, compassionate, and committed artist whose films make the important link between self-representation and self-determination. and which amplify the voices of all too often disenfranchised or maligned Indigenous peoples of Canada. And we are humbled by the unstoppable spirit of Alanis the activist, a fierce warrior in her own right, a leader and role model who ceaselessly sticks with the communities she documents, fighting with them for years, decades even, after the credits have rolled. And so for these reasons, we created this award, the Alanis Obomsawin Award for Commitment to Community and Resistance, 5 years ago. And we gave the first one to John Grayson. And this time we did a big call for nominations. We were going to do the award every 2 years, but it looks like it's going to be every 5 years. We did a big round of call for nominations that went everywhere, and it went to our board of directors and a host of community judges who carefully considered the list of candidates, and Min Sook Lee's name was chosen among those people. And I just want to say that all of these films that Min Sook makes that we're here today to celebrate and honor really capture the spirit of this award and the spirit of the work that Alanis does, because they wouldn't be possible without all the work that Min Sook does with justice for migrant workers and in the community outside of the filmmaking practice. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Alanis up to give this award that has been made by a local artist here in Montreal, Glenn Lemesurier. Are you still here, Glenn? Okay. He's a local artist, and he made this amazing award that is probably this year going to be a little too heavy. Maybe I can help, but it's really beautiful. And Alanis, I'd like to invite you up to, if you'd like to say anything, you're more than welcome to, of course, as well.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I bet you'd like to have a drink now. We have only holy water. You know, in 1995, they celebrated 100 years of cinema. It meant that in 1895, the first film, which was shown by Louis Lumière in France, of a train coming into a station. And the audience, for the first time, had seen a film. Who was sitting in the audience got really frightened because the train, it felt as if the train was coming straight at them. And they say that some of them even got up and ran away from the theater. And it was only when the train turned left on the frame of the screen that people were relieved. But can you imagine if at that time that sequence would have had the sound of the train? Can you imagine what would have happened? Because there was no sound, and for a long time they made films, silent films, and then later on it began to have a separate track of sound, and it was not until 1927 that the first film came out with an actual soundtrack, and it was the jazz singer. And after that, of course, you know, there was a lot of experiment with sound, and the equipment that was first done to try and get images were from these people who were really genius, wanting to image reality. And just think of all this time, and we have this lady who's really showing us what reality is on film. And for me, it's so touching and it's so wonderful. And it means that those people have a voice. And that's what documentary is about. The power of the word and image is right there on the screen. And this is how we can influence changes, change attitude in the public at large, create some kind of feeling that comes from the heart for another person that you don't know, to smile at the stranger, to make people feel welcome. All those things we can do with film, and it's amazing. You can help influence people who have the power to change laws. And this is the reason why I continue making documentary films. And thank you for being here, and I can't wait to see this award. Ooh la la. Hey, it's beautiful. It looks like you're undressing. Ooh. Isn't it beautiful? Oh my God.
Maybe I should. You want to feel it? You want to hold it? It's heavy. It's amazing, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
it's got the reels, got everything.
It's incredible.
So I guess thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and Minsted's got to take this back to Toronto. And thank you, Alanis, for coming and joining us again. Hopefully it's sooner next time. Thank you all.